Well, welcome everyone. We're so happy to have all of you this evening. Let me kick it off by just welcoming all of you. My name is Abraham Kim. I'm the Executive Director at the Council of Korean Americans. Thank you for joining what will be, I hope, a very informative and inspiring evening of talks with our distinguished panelists. Um, before I introduce our audience this evening, I wanted to provide a little bit of context about this project, this report that we released a few days ago. This project actually got started about 2 years ago with a number of conversations with Korean American civic leaders from across the country about some of the biggest needs of our community. In these discussions, one of the biggest wishes that were expressed to me and to many of our leaders at CKA was the access to good data on the Korean American community, especially on a regional and a national level. Yes, there were surveys and quantitative data on the general Asian American Pacific Islander community, but as a whole, but disaggregated data specifically on the Korean American community was really limited. And when you have kind of this lack of targeted data on the Korean American community, you miss the unique nuances and the challenges are often overlooked that are very specific to our community. And in addition, without the strong data on the Korean American community, it's difficult to determine in a scientifically rigorous way what the priority needs of the community is. And besides anecdotes, civic leaders were having a hard time providing grant making foundations and government agencies with empirical evidence about the severity of problems that were plaguing the Korean Americans. And finally, without measurements and metrics, it was difficult to determine whether societal problems were actually improving. So, in response to this need, CKA connected with Dr. Taeku Lee, one of our guest speakers this evening. He's the associate dean and professor of political science and law at UC Berkeley to help us address this information gap in the Korean American community. And lucky for us, Dr. Lee was not only a CKA member, but he was also one of the most preeminent scholars of ethnic and racial politics, as well as a top expert on public opinion and survey work in the United States. So last year, we commissioned Dr. Lee to take the first step in what we hope will be a multi-year data and survey initiative to study the state of the national Korean American community, its many challenges, and its progress. So we asked Dr. Lee to pull together the most interesting existing national data on the Korean American community and write an analysis. And we hope this initial effort will generate discussions and discover gaps that we need to invest more of our time and resources to research. So the result was the paper that all of you have hopefully had the opportunity to read. And we hope this paper will help to generate momentum for the next step of this national data initiative, which is to identify areas of need for more data research and to do original survey work on the Korean American community. So in line with our mission of supporting leaders and amplifying the voice of our community, CKA's goal through this project is to provide data tools for our civic leaders so we can all more effectively address the needs of our community across the country. So tonight, we have also, in addition to inviting Dr. Taeku Lee to present on his findings, two distinguished and important civic leaders as discussants for their perspectives on this report. First is Connie Chung Joe. She is the Chief Executive Officer of the Asian American Advancing Justice in Los Angeles, which is the nation's largest legal and civil rights organization for Asian Americans, Native Hawaiians, and Pacific Islanders. And she is a celebrated public interest lawyer and civic leader who has served the Southern California AAPI community. And secondly is Linda Lee. She's the president and CEO of the Korean Community Services of Metropolitan New York, which serves over 1,300 community members daily. And in addition, this important organization is a New York State licensed Article 31 mental health clinic serving the Korean American community with mental health services. So we have three very distinguished speakers tonight, and I'm very excited to turn over the mic to them. But before I do, I want to say a few things. One is I want to thank a few people who actually, through their tremendous generosity, has allowed us to start this initiative. They're Peter and Ji-hee Ha, Eugene and Carol Choi, and the Overseas Korean Foundation that provided some of the initial funding to help us do this report. And also to all of you, as we're later on, we'll be taking questions from the audience. Please feel free to write your questions in the chat box below. So with that, I turn it over to Taeku for your presentation. Taeku?
Great. Thank you so much, Abe. And as you can see from the weird lighting on my face, it's actually sunset out here in California. I'd like to start first by offering my deepest thanks to Abe Kim, to the CKA board, and to the sponsors of this project for the opportunity to prepare this report, and to the CKA staff for putting it all together so beautifully and brilliantly, and also to Linda and Connie for your willingness to comment on this report tonight. I'm especially grateful for this opportunity because I spend most of my professional life as a researcher thinking about collecting, analyzing data on American politics, especially on racial and ethnic groups, and especially on Asian Americans, but I've never really had the time or occasion to delve deeply into data on Korean Americans in particular. So I started with a lot of curiosity about, what are the data out there and what can we learn about them, about the state of the Korean American community today? What data are missing and what do we not know about the status of Korean Americans as a result? And the report is chock full of data and findings, and I'm humble enough to recognize that it's a fool's errand to try to summarize the entirety of the report in 10 minutes. So instead, let me try to pull out three key areas or themes from the report. And these are themes that very much could describe 2020. In thinking about what I might say, it was hard for me not to remember and reflect back on the year that we would probably all like to forget. 2020 challenged all of us with a triple threat of crises, each of which by itself would have been a defining once-in-a-generation moment: the COVID pandemic, the movement for Black lives, and the 2020 election. Each of these three moments represented the nation at a crossroads and revealed underlying structural challenges facing the nation. So a public health crisis that exposed underlying social and economic inequalities in America, a flashpoint on race in America that exposed unanswered questions about our criminal justice system, social unrest, and unequal citizenship in America, and a critical election that exposed not just social, political, and racial polarization in America, but also polarization over what counts as truth and a threat to democracy itself. These underlying challenges are what I want to try to surface and highlight to try to connect the year we have just lived through and survived with what we know about the status of Korean Americans today. So, first, the pandemic. The pandemic demands that we think about the well-being of Korean Americans, not just in terms of how well Korean Americans are doing on average, in terms of their educational attainment and economic prosperity, but also in terms of who in our community are at risk and are especially vulnerable. So here I'd call the audience's attention to the following findings from the report. One, while Korean Americans overall are a highly educated group, their educational attainment is not matched by a commensurate level of economic fortune in terms of median household incomes. So for example, the mean annual personal income in 2018 for a Korean American with a college degree was just above $48,000, while in the US overall, that mean was well above $60,000 a year. In addition, rates of living in poverty are generally lower for Korean Americans than national averages, but they're much higher among older Korean Americans, who are twice as likely to fall below the poverty line. Nearly 20% of Korean Americans 65 and older in 2018 lived in poverty because, and because these are 2018 numbers, you can be pretty sure that that figure today is even higher. And there is also evidence from census data that income inequality within the Korean American community is substantially higher than it is overall in the United States. And we all know that income inequality is extremely high in the United States as it is. Then turning to healthcare, access to healthcare for Korean Americans is critically dependent today on coverage through the Affordable Care Act. Prior to the ACA's passage and implementation, more than 1 in 4 Korean Americans were without health insurance. And recent estimates are that if the ACA were to be repealed today, that figure would be even higher at about 30% of Korean Americans without health insurance. And finally, COVID is a reminder that public health and mental health challenges are incredibly important to track and address. This is an area where there are suggestive bits of information, such as high rates of alcohol use among Korean Americans and high rates of psychological distress. But this is also in particular an area in which there are major gaps in the available data. Turning next to the flashpoint on race relations in America, I think we all lived through, experienced, and even participated in a spring and summer of Black Lives Matter protests, which raise important questions about whether Korean Americans also face adversity and barriers based on their background, and about what kind of relations Korean Americans hold with other communities of color in the United States. A few key findings from the report here. First, while Koreans, like other Asians in America, are often cast as prosperous model minorities free from racial discrimination, the data really suggests otherwise. 1 out of 4 Korean Americans sees discrimination against Korean Americans as a major problem, and nearly 1 in 3 Korean Americans reported personally experiencing discrimination in at least one of the 6 contexts of discrimination that we surveyed about. In addition, 88% of Korean Americans reported having experienced at least some type of microaggression in the past month. Microaggressions here can be thought of as everyday verbal or nonverbal slights, snubs, or insults. And the most common ones for Korean Americans are being assumed that you are naturally good in STEM fields, having your name mispronounced, being assumed to be a non-English speaker, receiving poor service in stores, restaurants, being called names or insulted, and being assumed to lack creativity. These findings point to high levels of racism and discrimination faced by Korean Americans. And partly as a result of this, another finding in the report is that Korean Americans, more so than any other Asian American group, believe that they share a linked fate with other Koreans and other Asians in the United States. So 2/3 of Korean Americans believe that what happens to other Korean Americans and to other Asian Americans will affect what happens in their life. Finally, the report also finds significant evidence of continued isolation from and friction with other racial groups. Compared to other Asian American groups, Korean Americans are much likelier to report high rates of daily social contact just with other Asians, and conspicuously low rates of daily social contact with Latinos and African Americans. In addition, when asked how well Korean Americans get along with other groups, the report finds that Koreans are least likely to get along well with African Americans. In fact, a majority of Korean Americans report getting along with Blacks poorly, compared to only 1 in 3 who report getting along with Latinos poorly, and less than 1 in 5 who report getting along with white Americans poorly. These findings paint a sobering view of the challenges facing Korean Americans in their interactions with other racial and ethnic groups in the United States. So some 3 decades after the Red Apple boycotts in Flatbush in Brooklyn in 1990, Sun Jadu's killing of Latasha Harlins in LA in 1991, and the LA uprising in 1992, Black Korean relations remain marked by infrequent daily contact and widespread perceptions that Blacks and Koreans do not get along. Lastly, in the third troika of the 2020 crises, the election and what it portends for the future of our politics and our democracy. Here, to borrow from Charles Dickens, at least for Korean Americans, 2002 was really the best of times and the worst of times. It was the spring of hope and the winter of despair. On the positive side of the ledger, there is growing evidence that Korean Americans are beginning to take shape and rise up as a political community. In just 2 election cycles, our representation in Congress has increased from 0 to 1 to 4. And on the ground, the conventional wisdom that Korean Americans underparticipate and straddle undecided between the 2 parties in how they vote is beginning to change. Korean Americans in the electorate are rising in number, and in states like Georgia, where the Korean American population is growing dramatically, Korean Americans, together with other Asian Americans and Latinos, are increasingly becoming the margin of victory in elections. Furthermore, the data clearly show that Korean Americans today have consolidated into a solidly democratic voting bloc and stand on the liberal, progressive end of the spectrum on most policy issues. At the same time, on the other side of the ledger, Korean Americans continue to be less likely to be contacted and mobilized and recruited into politics, even while overall rates of contact and mobilization are increasing. So 2018 and 2020 were game changers that saw historical levels of mobilization of voters. But while all boats were rising, the Korean American mobilization and outreach boat was rising less quickly. In specifics, the mobilization rates for Korean Americans were about 10% lower in both 2016 and 2018, and I expect it would be true also for 2020, than they were for other Asian Americans. And the mobilization rates for Asian Americans overall are lower than they are compared to US averages. Finally, Korean Americans are also less likely to participate in politics beyond the ballot box. They are less likely to donate to or volunteer in campaigns, to attend rallies, to participate in protests and marches, sometimes by significant margins, and young Korean Americans, the data show, are even less likely to be active in politics. In an election year where the stakes of getting involved and making your voice heard could not be more important, the Korean American community still has a way to go in terms of gaining their full political empowerment. I have more prepared remarks, but I want to be mindful of time. So let me just conclude here and pass it over to Abe to introduce our commentators.
Well, thank you very much, Taeku, for that exceptional presentation. I think there has, for those of you who didn't get a chance to see the report, we actually put it in the chat. So you can download, you can click on the URL there and also download the report for your reading after this presentation. With that, I want to turn the floor over to Connie, who will be presenting her perspectives. And then after that will be Linda. So over to you, Connie.
Great, thank you, Abe. So in reading this report, a couple things that really stood out to me about what Taeku had captured. First is looking at what areas of the country are seeing a high increase in Korean American population and size. You know, areas, for example, like Atlanta, Georgia, we're seeing the community really explode down there. And it's been so important when you look at this most recent elections and what just happened with the Senate, to have a mobilization. And they talk very much about how powerful the Asian Pacific Islander, including the Korean American vote and mobilization, was for this recent election, and especially getting the 2 senators. And I would mention that Asian Americans Advancing Justice Atlanta, which is one of our sister affiliates, which is located, whose executive director is Korean American Stephanie Cho. she did a bang up job of going out there and mobilizing the vote and making sure to contact every Korean American voter to try to get them out to vote. And that made a difference. It most definitely made a difference to see in areas where the Korean community has really been exploding, and to see them really getting a voice and coming into their own in these areas. Kind of related to that is the civic engagement and political power of the Korean American community, which Taeku spoke to. I think this report came out right when we just got 3 new members of Congress elected, and to see what that impact will have is remains to be seen. But I am confident that it will have a very profound impact in seeing more Korean Americans start running for elected office at national level and as well as local levels. I think having particularly 3 Korean American members of Congress is very profound. And I think it's also interesting when you look at their immigration stories. We have 2 first generation or 1.5 generation Korean American immigrant members of Congress who are both conservative. And then you see our 2 second generation or American born Korean American members of Congress who are Democratic. And I think that is similar to some extent with where you look at the political lines and views of our first generation and second generation immigrant community. There is definitely more of first generation sort of conservative values still within that group compared to in the second generation Korean Americans. And you see that also in other immigrant groups such as the Vietnamese. But I think that was interesting to see. And I think it's really interesting to think about what will come next. Seeing now these members of Congress who have been elected, and seeing this movement of Korean Americans and Asian Americans coming out in this recent election, and seeing what kind of power they had in places like Wisconsin and in Georgia and other places. The last thing I want to talk about is the issue of race relations. It's interesting because just today, LA Times has a front cover story about the LAPD Olympic Station, which is the police station located in the heart of Koreatown. And this station came out after the 1992 LA riots, or Saigu. And there was, the police chief said that this was one of the 3 stations that he was going to close down. And when he said that, there was a mobilization of, especially within the Korean American community, with 17,000 petitions signed to keep that open. And when you read this article, certainly it starts to capture about some of the race relations there. And it talks about, after the LA riots, the Korean community felt so defenseless and unprotected at that time. As community members were standing on their rooftops, calling 911 and no one would respond. So they started calling into the Korean radio and sharing this is where I'm located. This is where the looting is at, because that was the only way to get a response when the government was not doing something. And how that safety is important to the community after that experience. But then the article also talks about the Black Lives Matter movement and the interest and the power to defund the police, and how police has a very different presence and relationship in the Black community. And in one way, I think it's a valid point to talk about that kind of juxtaposition, but I also think that this becomes a common and oversimplified narrative of the mainstream media to pit it as a Black versus Korean story. We hear it all the time, and it's a simple and a very simplistic, but I guess generally appealing story to do to a mainstream audience. And I would just say that it's important to unpack that a little further. One thing that I would say about when we talk about the issues with race relations, part of it, in my mind, I wonder how much that has to do with the linguistic isolation of our Korean community. In the report, Taeku mentions that 31% of Korean Americans come from linguistically isolated households. My understanding of that definition from Census is that no one in the home who is 15 or older speaks English fluently. Now, interestingly, in LA, we at Advancing Justice do a report called Community Contrast, where we use the census data. And our reports from 2010 in LA said that Korean Americans were 47% linguistically isolated here in LA. But still, 31% means 1 in 3 of our Korean Americans nationwide are linguistically isolated. And what does that mean? How are you able to interact with people from other races and relations if you cannot even communicate with them? If you're linguistically isolated, you are most certainly culturally isolated as well. And I think that often links what's happening with race and some of the dynamics there. But, part of me thinks that it is both. Yes, it is true that we have certainly issues with race relations and tensions, particularly between the Black and Korean community. But part of it feels that it is the public media's always putting that as a front of the discourse that also, I think, perpetuates that view, and it feeds into that story. Now, I think it is really important, from one of the lessons learned from this, is that how we need to find collaboration and partnership with other communities of color. With COVID, that's happened, and we saw the rise in anti-Asian hate crimes and discrimination as the Asian community was scapegoated. We know that there have been over 3,000 reported incidents of hate against the Asian Pacific Islander community since COVID. And we know that after Chinese, Koreans are the second highest group that's been targeted. And then when you see just a few months later, the murder of George Floyd and the rise in the Black Lives Matter movement, what you see is that discrimination and hate crimes we are not immune to that, right? We are vulnerable to that. And what's happened, though, is I think there is this attempt in this kind of larger structure to always pit Black versus Korean, or Black versus, or, brown versus Korean, or Asian versus Black and brown. If you look historically at Asian American history, you see that this is part of a larger structure to keep a wedge between communities of color, right? So there's sort of a hierarchy when you look at first, if whites have the power, then where do the rest of us stand in that pecking order? And I think Asian Americans, we've often been, and Korean Americans have been lulled into this model minority view that, we're doing better. We're academically better. We're economically somewhat better than these other communities. And somehow we're a little bit more closer to the white community in that way. And I would challenge that narrative, that I think that is more problematic, in that it allows us to be wedged in between us with other communities of color, when we should be in allyship, when you're looking at things like the discrimination that we are facing, and that we are not immune to it in the same way other communities are not immune to it, or the xenophobia. So I think those were the issues that I think most stood out at me. I would mention that, as Taeku said, that the mental health was something that I would love to have seen a little bit more. We did see, alcohol discussed. I wear my hat as the CEO of Asian Americans Advancing Justice LA, which is a position I've had for about 6 months now. But prior to that, I was for 11 years the executive director of a Korean-specific nonprofit organization in LA called Korean American Family Services. And we did provide services in mental health, domestic violence, and child welfare to the Korean American community, where 90% of our clients were limited English-speaking Koreans. So seeing it from that perspective as well, knowing about those, I think, social services are important. If I could just add one last thing, is that I think it's important to highlight again the kind of the disparities between where we're doing well and then also where our needs are. I think when you look at certain groups, you have seniors and certainly a large number of limited English proficient Koreans, that these are vulnerable communities that, beyond what their income level and their education level it shows, there are other barriers and other kind of vulnerabilities they experience. So even if you have some general level of wealth, if you don't speak English well and you can't navigate the American cultural system, or you can't navigate language in order to access services or to advocate for yourself, it is disempowering, and there is a loss there that is not always calculated when you just look at how many of us went to college or what is our income level. And so I would say that that would be worthy of kind of unpacking more. Certainly, I know in the reports that we did at Advancing Justice, we looked at, for example, Korean seniors, and we found that in that group in LA, they had some of the highest poverty rates amongst any ethnic group when it came to the 50 and older population. So even though Koreans in general seem to be doing economically very well, when you unpack the data and you look at certain groups, you're starting to see some really severe needs. Under COVID, those needs have only been underscored and made so much worse. You know, we see Korean seniors and Haimanis and Haribojis who are living in their cars and who are homeless, and they cannot get service because they can't speak English, and none of the homeless shelters know what to do when an Asian person comes to them. And I've heard of stories of people literally wandering around a homeless shelter for days before they figured out what language the person spoke in order to be able to provide some sort of service. So I would say under COVID, we're just seeing such an extreme challenge, particularly for those more vulnerable members of our community. And that, I think, is something worth kind of seeing how that plays out later on in the future. Thank you.
That is actually the perfect segue to what I was going to talk about, because I'm coming from the lens of more of the social service perspective. So my organization is here in New York City, in Queens, where a lot of the community is. The Korean community in New York is located. Don't mind my DIY plastic wrap on my window to keep out the cold air, but I'm sure a lot of the East Coast folks can relate to that. So yeah, I mean, a lot of what I'm going to talk about is more from the social service perspective, and hopefully I think a lot of what I'm going to share, I would imagine, is similar to what other Korean communities are seeing across the nation. But, you know, just in the work that we've been doing here, you know, I cannot express how important data is, because one of the things that we're constantly faced with all the time as a nonprofit provider is whenever we go to advocate for different policies or different fundings or different government you know, efforts that we're trying to push along, the question we always get is, okay, so where's the data that shows that this is an issue in your community? And that's always been a challenge for us. And so that's why pretty early on when I started working here, we did work with a lot of Asian community groups to do research as well as advocacy and rallying all the Asian groups together to come together to say, we are now 15% and growing of New York City's population, and yet we receive only about 1% of the city dollars towards services in our community, which is totally unacceptable. We're the fastest growing in New York, more than the Latino community. And I think, speaking to how we relate to other communities of color, we actually built partnerships with other communities of color, with the Black and Brown and Latino community, and basically said, hey, we're not, just so you know, we're not trying to take away from your pie, but our whole thing is, how do we come together as communities of color to say, how do we increase the pie for the city? Because everyone knows that preventative services, social services actually save the city and state dollars. So that's a huge advocacy effort that we did on our side, which took a lot, you know, because of course, when you have a new community coming in saying, no, you got to give us our fair share, it could be off-putting, right? But it's actually it was very important to us that we partnered with folks in other communities alongside with us. Also, the thing that became evident and so important is we need to make sure that we have a seat at the table, because one thing I quickly realized after working at KCS is that it's all about policy. And if we're not being represented in local, state, federal governments, it's going to be really hard for them to pass legislation and laws that actually positively impact our communities. And one of the things that we were able to actually push forward was, you know, for example, we needed to change, this is a very New York specific issue, but we needed to change some of the ways that the funding streams were happening with our Meals on Wheels program, because we're the only ones that provide Meals on Wheels to all of the Korean seniors in New York City. And the city council really worked with us to educate themselves on what the issues were and also change some of the systems that were in place there. And you know, similarly with our mental health clinic, you know, it's been a very daunting reminder that someone up in Albany, in New York's capital, who most likely does not look like us, is deciding on legislation and policy that dictates how I deliver my services downstate in Flushing, in a predominantly non-English speaking community, around mental health, right? And there's a lot of cultural differences. It's like people in our communities are not going to be receptive to the Western way of doing therapy in mental health. So there's a lot of interesting partnerships, though, that came out of that, where we were able to get some grant funding to look at how do we stay compliant with the state regulations, but offer the services in a way that is a bit more culturally sensitive and in language. So, you know, there's a lot of challenges that we've been seeing on the ground, but I think, you know, one of the things that we've been really trying to do is partnership, data collection. So we've been working, for example, with NYU School of Medicine. They have what's called the Center for the Study of Asian American Health. And they're one of the few, if not only, academic institutions in the New York metro area that I know of that actually has an Asian-specific centered institution that looks at chronic diseases, specifically around the Asian community. So we've worked with the Taxi Workers Alliance, as well as the Sikh community, the Chinese community, to look at what are the issues around diabetes, what are the issues around you know, Alzheimer's and hypertension and blood pressure in our communities, because there's just no data. That's the problem. And so we've been able to partner with institutions like NYU, where they have the academic expertise to be able to do the research. And then we, as the community partners, have the reach into the community, right? So it's something called CBPR, Community-Based Participatory Research. And it's been, I have to say, an amazing venture where we've worked on several grants now through CDC and NIH, where we're able to create white papers, put them in academic and medical journals, and then put it out there. So in that way, I think it's been great to figure out what are some of the creative ways that we can look at to partner with private and public to make sure that we're getting the data out there. And so I think that's really crucial for those of you guys who are on this call who work with social service organizations. I think, you know, that's a very natural, great way to reach out. Like as soon as we got our mental health clinic, I started reaching out to different health institutions saying, hey, we need to utilize this clinic also to put data out there around mental health in the Korean American community, because there is none, right? And, you know, having known a lot of close friends of mine that have struggled with mental health issues, it's definitely a very real issue in our community that needs to be highlighted more. And just emphasizing that we need to really push to the community, that we need to have a seat at the table. And this I cannot emphasize more, because, for example, 7 years ago, I joined my local community board in Queens, which was predominantly older and also predominantly white. So the question I got, I don't know if you guys know Congresswoman Grace Meng, but she's one of our reps out here. So the question I got whenever I walked into the meeting was, oh, are you part of Grace Meng's staff? And I was like, no, I'm a community board member here. And I think the thing that shocked me the most is that in a city like New York that's very diverse, what shocked me was not that I was only one of 2 Asians on the community board, but by far I was the youngest person. So I stayed on the community board because I was like, okay, I can't ask other people to join groups like this if they don't see someone that looks like them that's part of these groups. And that's also why I decided to put my hat in, and I was appointed as one of the commissioners of the Civic Engagement Commission in New York City, because we need to have that voice at the table and that Korean American representation. You know, I think it's great to have as many Asian voices as possible. And it was great to see so much diversity on that commission, but, you know, definitely we need to get out the vote. And if I could just make one final plug when it comes to the civic engagement, KCS, so I don't know if you guys know, but a couple of years ago, New York State actually started doing early voting. So KCS, our community center here in Bayside, Queens, is actually an early voting site. So this presidential election, I was like, yeah, we got to get out the vote. We got to open our lines early. And I cannot tell you how long the lines were. It was absolutely insane. Every single day for early voting for like 15 days straight, 10 days straight. It was absolutely insane. But what was very eye-catching for me was that it was still very predominantly white voters that were coming. And I was sort of like, man, where are the Koreans and where are the Asians? Because there's a lot of Asians actually in this area. And I was kind of hoping to see more folks coming out, because I do think, even though some people may say things like, oh, New York is a blue state, it doesn't really matter. No, it actually matters, because the state and local elections were also last year. So those things matter. And I think we need to continue pushing people. And even in my local city council district where I live in, 43% is Asian. And of the Asian, it's a split between 60% South Asian and 40% East Asian. So 43% Asian in that small one city council district, there's 51. So out of one city council district, I have 43% Asian. But if you look at who votes, it's 45% white. And then the Asians then drop down to about 23%. So I think there's, and also the majority of them are older, like 50 and above. It's about 73% voters that are 50 and above. So there's a lot of younger folks. When I say younger, I guess I mean me too. I don't know, but there's a lot of folks even around my age who I know that are not voting. And so, you know, there's a lot of issues that are important to local politics, especially schools, you know, a lot of the state issues like Medicaid, healthcare, a lot of that is city and state. So I think it's important for us to keep pushing that narrative, and for us to help people connect the dots, right? Like, it's important for you to vote, because who you vote for will represent the district that then creates laws and policies that then dictate how your Meals on Wheels get delivered to your home or not gets delivered to your home, or what kind of mental health services you have. And that impacts everything else. So I think we need to also make sure people understand why their vote actually counts and why it matters. And so hopefully that's something as a community that we can continue to push.
Well, thank you very much to both of you, to Connie and Linda, for those insightful comments. And I do have to mention, as a nonpartisan organization, we support all voting, right? So across the board, Korean Americans. And so I just have to make that plug. But we want to take this opportunity to open up the floor for our audience to ask questions. And please put your questions in the chat box. But as people are preparing to prepare their questions and put in the chat box, I wanted to ask one final question to our panelists. And I think you've already alluded to some of this, which is our hope is that really this first report is a teaser, and really to start to not only stimulate conversations, but also identify some of the gaps within our community, and that gaps in the data, and what we would like to do if there is a follow-up report. What would you like to see in that report? If you can mention maybe one or two things briefly, that would be wonderful. How about if we start with our author, Taeku, if you can mention maybe some things you would like to see in future reports. Taeku?
Well, I had an answer to your question until you said pick one or two. I mean, so I'll pick four, but I'll be really quick, just because I think there are these four areas that come out pretty clearly in the report as areas that really warrant more data and more research. One is sort of the gap between what a lot of people, especially not a lot of non-Koreans, think about Korean Americans, which is their educational attainment, and how much economic inequality and how much economic struggle there actually is in the community. It's not really clear to me, you know, whether that's a geographic thing, whether that's a labor market segment thing. There could be a lot of reasons for it, whether it's because of the high preponderance of, you know, self-owned businesses. But I think that really requires a lot more inquiry. Area two is mental health. I think I did a lot of research that I could and found some great studies that were specific to cities. So there's a great study in Baltimore, there's a great study in Minneapolis, there's some great work in LA. There's actually some pretty good work for California, but in terms of how the community is doing nationally, I think that's just a huge gap in the data. Third is, I think, I completely agree, Connie, about the fact that media representations tend to lean too quickly and too easily on this idea that Blacks and Koreans are always going to be in this, conflictual relations to one another. But I think there's still this question about why, 3 decades after Saigu, it's still the case that Korean Americans tend not to, interact socially with Black Americans. And what does that mean in terms of, the important work to be done to make sure that that relationship doesn't become conflictual again in the way that it did 3 decades ago? And then the fourth area that I think, really, at least for me as a political scientist, I would love to know more about is this underparticipation. I think overall, 2018 and 2020 have been sort of game-changing elections where a lot more Americans are getting involved in politics because the stakes seem so high. It seems so high when you're losing your job. It seems so high when you don't know if your health insurance is going to be there or not. It seems so high when you have, pardon my slight partisanship, when you have an administration that says people who look like you actually don't belong in the United States. So there are a lot of reasons to get involved in politics, but at the same time, the data seem to show that Korean Americans participate less often than do other groups of Asians in the United States. And I would like to figure out what the reasons are behind it. One big reason that we already have data on is it's about language access. A lot of the polling work I did in 2020 show that even in 2020, even in highly contested elections like in the Georgia 7th Congressional District, 50% of the people we surveyed who were going to vote in that election said they didn't have any access to in-language election materials or in-language ballots. That's a huge, missed opportunity. But I think that's the fourth area where it would be great to have more data and to know more. So what explains the participation gap for Korean Americans?
Connie?
Great, thank you. So I would say first, what I would love to see is, Abe, you had mentioned original source data. And I would love to see that, particularly if there could be some surveys or data collected on more of the first generation or Korean speaking community members. What I find is often larger data sets that are used, in studies because they're big in scope and they're reputable, like Pew and things like that. I wonder how much are they able to really get to our immigrant community members and survey in language and penetrate that community? Because if you can't, then your research is being skewed by those who are going to be more comfortable speaking to groups like, Pew and know who that is and what that means. And that's going to be more your second generation or third generation English speaking Korean Americans. So I think we have an opportunity here with CKA specifically focusing on Korean Americans to maybe penetrate a little bit more into the first gen community, do it in language, and really get some rich data about that community that other surveys and reports won't be able to capture. Particularly around, as I mentioned, with politics and civic engagement. I think it's really fascinating how there tends to be a generational divide between who runs more conservative and who runs more progressive. But with recent elections and what happened recently, I wonder what's changed. I know in the Chinese American community, they talk about how the issues are more important than necessarily which party you're from. I don't know as much in the Korean American community if that's true. And I wonder with this recent election, did, for example, the fact that our president would make sort of anti-Asian comments, did that skew some more people to maybe vote for Biden this time around? Who, though otherwise, maybe their social values or their fiscal values would run more conservative? Does that matter? I think these are kind of interesting things that you can penetrate more about our first generation, our immigrant community, because one thing I've learned working in the Korean community is our first generation community and the second generation community are widely different. their viewpoints, their attitudes, their behaviors are often so different. And I learned that with working with our staff and our clients. And so I think it's just fascinating to think about that. And I agree, Taeku, what you said about race relations. It's still certainly an issue. And I think about the fact that even a couple of years ago in Baltimore, there were racial tensions between store owners who were Korean American with their customer base who were predominantly Black. I mean, it's a whole nother city than LA. It's decades later, but we're still seeing a repeat in certain patterns. And so we're studying that and breaking that down better. It is definitely something worth looking into more. I would say it would be nice to maybe counter that with looking at areas where there have been solidarity and the community coming together. I think in California, affirmative action is one area where Chinese for Affirmative Action took the lead, and there was a lot of API groups who also supported it, although there were a lot of APIs who didn't support it as well. But as Linda mentioned, there have been areas of partnership and solidarity with communities of colors between Koreans, other APIs, and Black and Brown communities that I think are worth kind of highlighting too. And then I think the last thing, and I'm mentioning this because it's come up in the chat, is people have been talking about the census data and what that's going to show. I think the census data is going to be really interesting, both what it shares with us as well as what it doesn't. Because of what happened with COVID, it was very challenging to reach what we call hard to count communities. These are, underserved, limited English proficient, immigrant communities who are usually kind of more scared about having surveys and staying under the government radar. And it was challenging when the administration wanted to add questions about citizenship. Things like that tend to scare away a lot of immigrants. And the deadline kept trying to be pushed up when advocates who were trying to reach these communities kept trying to extend the deadline because of COVID. Now, what's going to happen is when we see this data is, I think there is anticipation for people who did census that there's going to be a severe undercounting of hard to reach populations. And not only that, but what's interesting is there was actually a competition done by the census because they wanted to see if they gave certain data information, could people figure out who that person was? And they actually found out in the competition that some people could. And so what that meant is if the data set gets too small, you can actually figure out who someone is. So in Korean American populations that are still in smaller metropolitan areas or geographies, if the data gets too specific and you can actually start to pinpoint and identify people, then that data is not going to be released. And so it's going to be interesting to see both what comes out, but what doesn't come out, because we're not going to be able to get some of that data. And that's very challenging. At our organization where we're trying to do work with the census and do demographic research work, we're looking at so many smaller ethnic communities in pockets, and Korean Americans all over the country are one of them. If we can't get to that data because they're saying it's too easy to figure out who people are, we're going to lose a lot of really valuable information about our community. Linda, I'll turn it to you.
I feel like we're like a newscast report. Honestly, when I think I had a lot more questions when I was reading this in terms of what we could dig in a little more, because I think I have the same question that Connie did, which was, I wonder how the results could look different if it was in Korean versus, I'm guessing it was in English, right? Or it was only in English, the study or survey, or was it Korean also?
Yeah, for all the surveys that I do, it's in multiple languages.
Oh, okay, yeah. Good. Yeah, no, so that was actually one question I had, was like, oh, I wonder if this was just in English or if it was in Korean and English. So I think that's good to know, because I was curious to see how that would impact some of the first gen responses, or if they were willing to participate, because I feel like that's one of the challenges, is that our community oftentimes is very hesitant about participation, which I think impacted the census too, because of the immigration question and all these other things, the threat of having that on there. And I think for me, I would love to maybe do some more digging around for sure the mental health piece of it. I gotta say, I think, when we first opened up our clinic in 2015, I remember thinking, okay, we're kind of going on gut and narrative here versus like actual data in terms of opening up this clinic. So it was a risk for us. It took me like 4 years to open it, so it's a lot of risk. But I was like, okay, let's just hope that we get 100 clients in the door the first year. But we actually had 200 clients, right? And I was shocked because, you know, and really made me question, okay, so where were all these folks going before to get these services and get this help? And I don't know if there's a direct correlation of this at all, and I'd be curious to look into this, but one of the things that the folks at Elmhurst Hospital, so Elmhurst Hospital is one of 2 public hospitals in Queens, and they're one of the only ones that has an inpatient psych unit, and they do have Korean licensed clinical social workers. And one of the things that they did say was, you know, we don't know if it's directly related to the fact that you guys opened up your clinic, but we've been noticing that a lot of our Korean patients that come into the inpatient unit, usually it's like a revolving door. They get discharged and they come right back in. But they noticed a decrease in those people who were coming in their doors. And so they were like, you know, we don't know 100% if it's due to the fact that you guys opened your clinic, but we think there may be a correlation there. And just understanding and how to, you know, have that data available and to see, you know, how we can expand this, you know, because it is challenging from a government perspective to get these licenses and provide these types of services. And so how do we advocate as a community for them to give out these licenses more to different communities of color that speak different languages? You know, so I think if we were to have a data set point, it might be helpful, not just for us, but for other communities as well. And just digging a bit more into the poverty aspect of things. I know that the senior population, you know, and you showed it directly, you know, it's totally what you wrote in your report is totally what we're seeing on the ground. We see a lot of seniors that are living in 1-bedroom apartments, but there's like 4 seniors living together because they just cannot afford rent. And they are not, like, the wait list for senior affordable housing in New York City is just astronomical. There's not enough of it. And so a lot of the seniors are sort of relegated to these types of managed solutions. And so I'd be interested to see how we can dig deep, and then also what that would imply from a policy perspective and a funding perspective. So, yeah.
Well, thank you. Our time is quickly running out here, and we do have a couple of questions, and a couple of them are just quick data points. And then how about if I direct these questions to Taeku? This is more of a data point, is that from Hepin, she says, are there any current reports or surveys to count the business closures and job income losses of Korean Americans? I imagine as a result of COVID-19, if there's anything that's going on related to that. And then secondly, are there any reports about surveys about what work sectors, industries, and professions that Korean Americans are being employed in, and what trend lines are showing? And that's from Jenny Choi Fitzpatrick in terms of data. And then just a final note to Linda and Connie from Trisha Chong. More of a service oriented question is, how can existing social service nonprofits, especially national ones, better serve Korean Americans and AAPIs in general? So how about if we kick it off with you, Taeku, in terms of closures and job loss for Korean Americans, is any data being collected on that? And then trend lines in terms of what kinds of jobs and professions Korean Americans are pursuing.
So I think on the impact of COVID, I don't know for sure, but I would bet that if anybody is collecting some of those data, it would be the Urban Institute. And then on the trend data in terms of what kinds of jobs people are going to, I think those data are available somewhere. I just have never downloaded them and looked into them. So if you just send me an email, I'll try to direct you to the right place where those data sit.
Linda or Connie, real quick about social services, how better to serve.
So I will say a few things. One is that I think those organizations, should have Asian Pacific Islanders or Korean Americans on their board, because that's leadership and that's an important influencer. That they should have staff who are bilingual, bicultural, and have a language access plan, so that way they're able to serve folks, and not only just having the counselor who's there, but how are they going to handle the call at the receptionist? How are they going to get to that therapist themselves? I would also advocate, and I've always advocated, that organizations should subcontract more with ethnic specific organizations, because it's not just about having that one person who speaks the language on your staff. It's about having the infrastructure and the trust and an entity that the community believes in and will come to. So it was always a pet peeve of mine at KFAM that you'd have these mega organizations who'd say, I have a Korean staff and I have a Chinese staff, and so we're bicultural. And I would say, no, that one person cannot handle the whole community, and nor does that make your organization culturally responsive. So those are some of the things that I would mention.
Yeah, no, I definitely think it's important. And I saw that Brendan wrote the comment in the chat box, which is actually honorable. Like it's a good thing to mention, because the Federation did a report impact on COVID and unemployment within the Asian American community, which I think is important to note. And I have to say that is something we have seen a huge uptick in. Like just so you guys know, one of the things we did to pivot during COVID is we never assisted community members before with applying for unemployment insurance benefits. Like that wasn't really our thing, but then we naturally just started doing that because we got so many requests. And so I think, you know, the very obvious thing was that, you know, the websites where you have to apply for unemployment, they're only in English. And also, if you don't know how to use the computer or technology, it's really difficult to access those benefits. And so we literally had someone from our staff just sitting with folks by appointment only, you know, staying safe, and just filling and helping them to fill out their unemployment insurance application forms. I think, you know, it's crazy. I feel like whenever there's a pandemic or a natural disaster, that's when nonprofits and social service groups get busier because we're just trying to constantly put out fires and meet the needs of people in the community. But one thing I will say is that I think one area that I've noticed is huge that folks have stepped up in is funders, I know, have been very gracious to give us operating dollars to use in ways that are more flexible, which I think is a big deal. And so I think for donors, people at foundations like KACF, because I know Brandon's on here, but you know, for groups that those kind of that have access to those types of funding grants, I think one of the ways that they have been responsive in the New York community is really giving us those one-time grants that will give us that flexibility to use those dollars, and I think that's huge because you know, no one wants to talk about overhead admin costs. Like it's not a sexy topic, but it's very much needed for groups to be able to quickly pivot. And so I think that's what really has allowed us that flexibility and just really, you know, partnering with other nonprofits and private institutions on the ground who've been able to donate a lot of in-kind goods and services like PPE equipment, that's been crucial. So whatever more of that can be done in the different communities across the country, I think is very well needed. Yeah.
Well, on that note, thank you very much to all of you, to Taeku for the wonderful report, and hopefully it will be, well, our intent is it will be the beginning of an amazing conversation and other future reports that we hope. And we hope to incorporate all of Linda and Connie's, and Taeku's a recommendation on future reports as well. But with that, I just want to thank all three of you for your tremendous insights and your time. And thank you very much. And I encourage all of you, all of our audience, thank you very much for joining us this evening. And the report is available. And if you have any questions, there are emails on our report that you can send emails to us as well. And with that, thank you very much for joining us this evening. So thank you, Linda, Connie, and Taeku. So on behalf of the community, thank you.